For decades, Anne Perry was known as a popular writer of murder mysteries. Then, in 1994, the release of a new movie revealed her deepest, darkest secret. Anne Perry wasn't her real name. 40 years earlier, when she was just 15, she was involved in one of New Zealand's most notorious murder cases. With this scandalous revelation exposed, Anne was forced to confront the real-life mystery that's haunted her entire life. Who was she really? And what drove her to do what she did? We'll dive into that and much more in this episode of Dead Sleep True Crime for Bedtime. I'm Nancy Miller, and if you fell asleep or didn't get a chance to listen to the previous episode called Heavenly Creatures, that's okay. You can still enjoy this episode and jump back to the other one later. And before we get started, I wanted to say thank you to all of the new followers of the show. Thank you to the True Crime for Bedtimers in LA, Denver, and New York, and welcome new listeners in the UK, Canada, and Norway. Wherever you are, let's settle in for the night, close our eyes, and get ready to fall dead asleep with the continuing saga of a film called Heavenly Creatures that's about to turn one unsuspecting woman's existence into a living hell. It was July 1994. Anne Perry, a famous novelist in her 50s, was in the midst of an expensive renovation. She lived on the water in Scotland. A lot of seagulls, few people. Tall and striking with tinted auburn hair in an intensity that people found alluring and quirky, Anne was finally easing into her success. Since 1979, Anne had churned out novels, at least one, often two, a year. Her formula for success was Victorian-era detective stories, murder mysteries a reader could get lost in. And her latest was her most successful yet, thanks to a detective series she launched in 1990. That book was called The Face of a Stranger. The lead character was a savvy detective with a major fatal flaw. The detective suffered from amnesia. He could crack every case, except who exactly he really was. When he looked in the mirror, he saw the face of a stranger. Anne's problem was the converse. When she looked in the mirror, she was the only one who really knew who she was. Until July 29th, 1994, when she received a phone call that would change everything. On the phone was her book agent. Her agent told her a reporter had just called and said the most ridiculous thing. This reporter was calling to confirm that Anne Perry, the mystery novelist, was actually formerly a girl named Juliet Hume. Juliet was one half of some infamous Parker Hume murder case in New Zealand that this agent had never heard of. Her agent assured Anne that she'd told the reporter that that was ridiculous, and she was calling Anne to let her know they planned to get a lawyer and threatened an injunction. Anne would later describe in a biography called Searching for Anne Perry how she felt in that moment. Like the first wave of an atomic explosion. She felt the room receding, her head pounding like a drum. You can't refute it, Anne told her agent, because it's true. Then she told her agent the secret that she'd kept close for 40 years. How one summer day in 1954, she and her best friend Pauline had led Pauline's mother to a park outside of their hometown of Christchurch, New Zealand, and then bludgeoned her with half of a brick shoved inside a woman's stocking. The two girls had claimed Pauline's mother had fallen and hit her head, that it was an accident, but they'd left the murder weapon, the stocking with the half-brick, behind, mere feet from the woman's body. There was a lot Anne didn't remember from that day. Lost to time, or to shock, or the simple need to move forward. In 1959, after spending 5 years in prison, she was handed a passport with a new name on it, then spirited away on a plane and brought back to England to live with her mother as Anne Perry. Her agent was shocked, but as she took in what Anne told her, it gave her insight into Anne's unique behavior, how she never talked about her childhood, only that she was very sick as a girl, how she was charming but awkward and always distant. Her agent expressed her support and said they'd figure it out together. Anne was relieved because her life had been lonely, burdened by guilt. As Juliet, she'd been skeptical of religion, but as Anne, she found solace in God and became a Mormon. One of the perks of being a Mormon was a global community. Anywhere she went, she could find people who'd accept her, no questions asked. She had a few Mormon friends. She kept her circle small. During the trial, 40 years ago, much was made about Pauline and Juliet as teen lovers. But adult Anne was definitively hetero. But it didn't matter. Whatever her type, she never had a long-term relationship. It was too risky. She stayed in her comfort zone. So this tiny Scottish hamlet, with a total population of 500, including her 82-year-old sick mother who lived nearby, this was home. Her agent gave her her full support. And she warned her, the story is coming out on Sunday, July 31st, 1994. Anne braced herself for what was to come. The headline read, "Murder, She Wrote. Best-selling British author's grisly Kiwi past revealed." That was Sunday. By Monday morning, scores of journalists were camped out outside of her house. Photographers lurked with telephoto lenses, and television crews stomped around her property. They flooded her sickly mother's house, too. Anne was being hounded for comments, but she refused to speak to anyone. Anne's greatest fear was that the local townspeople would turn against her, along with her Mormon church community. So she ran to her minister, and she told him everything. And the minister told her something that couldn't possibly be true. He said that Anne wouldn't lose a single friend over this. Much to her surprise, the minister was right. The 500 people in her town stood by her. They dropped off food and told journalists to piss off. It'd been 40 years, they reasoned. Shouldn't she be allowed to have a life? Anne was elated by the community support, but the rest of the world was another matter. Mainly this movie, Heavenly Creatures. Anne and her PR team planned to torpedo it. Soon after that first newspaper article was published, Anne gave an exclusive interview to a British newspaper with a reporter she trusted. The reporter remembered visiting Anne at her home in Scotland and feeling alarmed. Anne appeared so stricken with anxiety and clinical shock, she couldn't sit or stand properly. Anne just leaned, her eyes in a daze. The interview wasn't Anne's most articulate, but it conveyed an important message. Yes, it was true. She did participate in the murder that happened in 1954. She served 5 years in prison, and she regarded it as a terrible mistake. She'd served her time, and she was very sorry. And now, she just wanted to move on. In the interview, she also criticized the movie as repugnant and she would go on to call Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh a couple of idiots. Later, she'd regret the severity of her statements, but at the time, all she wanted was for this movie and this scandal to go away. But it wouldn't. Heavenly Creatures was generating buzz, standing ovations at film festivals, with a scheduled release date in the U.S. for the fall of 1994. As news of Anne Perry's scathing reaction to Heavenly Creatures spread, Peter and Fran grew frustrated by Anne's movie bashing. They told reporters that Anne Perry didn't do a very good job of keeping her identity a secret. Besides, a half a dozen other producers had movies about her in the works, and that the story they told was all in the public domain. It was hard for Fran and Peter to admit, but somewhere in the creation of their film, they stopped thinking about Juliet and Pauline as people, and they saw them just as characters, which a creator has to do to tell a story. That's the difference between true crime storytelling and court stenography. Still, Peter and Fran were bummed. They'd never intended for this to happen. Peter Jackson had begged the reporter to not reveal Anne Perry's name. "You're not hunting Nazis," he told the reporter, who admitted she knew she was about to ruin a woman's life. But she was just doing her job. Fran and Peter hoped it would all blow over, and people were going to enjoy Heavenly Creatures for the acting, Kate Winslet and Melanie Lynskey in their first feature film, and the groundbreaking visual effects that Peter would later use for Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, and of course for the script, about the intoxicating friendship between the two girls. Fran and Peter had the luxury, however, of ending their story where they wanted to. Their movie ends the day Pauline's mother was killed. In real life, Anne and Pauline's lives continued. They were juveniles who were questioned by police without a parent or a lawyer present. When the case went to court, their legal team went with temporary insanity, a psychotic condition known as folie à deux, a shared delusion that drove them to kill. Their defense team hired a psychiatrist to testify the girls were clinically insane, a pair of dirty-minded, homosexual narcissists. His words, and should be committed, not imprisoned. Ultimately, that ploy didn't work, and the girls were found guilty. Pauline planned and executed the killing, but for some reason, maybe it was her Britishness, or her intelligence, or her arrogance, Juliet was seen as the ringleader who deserved more punishment. She was sent to the worst women's prison in New Zealand, where she lived in solitary confinement for 3 months. She didn't see the sky or sunlight for 4 years. She eventually realized her relationship with Pauline was unhealthy, and what she did was wrong. Anne Perry never imagined Heavenly Creatures might have been a compassionate take on her story, because there never had been before. But what made the film so good was how thoughtfully and accurately Fran and Peter depicted two very smart and emotionally isolated girls, whose connection was like a powerful drug. Maybe if Peter or Fran had reached out to Anne, they could have made peace. But that didn't happen. Instead, things escalated. In the winter of 1995, about 6 months since Anne Perry's name was revealed and the whole scandal broke, Anne was holding steady. She felt relieved that she had her community in Scotland behind her, that her 82-year-old mother was still alive, and that her latest book about the amnesiac detective was getting good reviews. There was trouble on the horizon. January of that year was the launch of her U.S. book tour. Anne considered canceling, but instead, she kept a stiff upper lip. She'd face whatever was waiting for her. Anne had a huge U.S. readership. 56% of her book sales were in the States. But who knew how her fans were going to react? She was known for her Mormon faith, for having a strong moral compass. Would Americans be sympathetic to someone like Anne? Someone who helped kill a girl's mother as a teenager? This was the mid-90s. Bill Clinton just signed a far-reaching federal crime bill, which allowed the return of the death penalty in several states, including capital punishment for juveniles. Would they understand that at the time she thought she was helping her friend? She worried that Pauline would take her own life and it would be her fault? Would they be on her side or think she was a degenerate hypocrite? She'd soon find out. There to stack the deck against her, from the moment her plane touched down, was Harvey Weinstein. As the head of Miramax, Harvey Weinstein was known for being a huge, flaming asshole. Vicious and crude, yet so powerful, people just bent to his will. Unfortunately, it would take decades for the totality of Weinstein's vile and criminal behavior to be exposed. What was on full display in the winter of 1995 was Harvey Weinstein's gleeful drive to destroy anyone who might hurt his company's success, especially an outspoken and intelligent yet vulnerable woman like Anne Perry. Reportedly behind Peter Jackson's back, Harvey Weinstein personally masterminded a marketing campaign for Heavenly Creatures that didn't just use Anne Perry. The advertising viciously trolled her. The ads appeared in every major newspaper with the headline, "Murder, She Wrote," and the rest was an open letter to Anne. It said, "We read that you want to put all this behind you, yet you have very publicly given your opinion on a movie you haven't seen." The ad continued to taunt her, with Weinstein personally offering to hold a seat for her at every showing of Heavenly Creatures, and telling her to please see the movie before she judged and spoke out against it. At the very end of the ad was a twisted call to action. The whereabouts of Pauline Parker were still a mystery, essentially goading people to track Pauline down and reveal her identity too. It was hateful. It was tacky. It was Harvey Weinstein. And it horrified Peter Jackson. When Anne arrived in the United States, she told her agent, if bookstores canceled her dates, she understood. But her readers, they stood by her all over the country. Even the most conservative small towns showed up to show their support. People told her things she hadn't heard before. Phrases like, "I'm sorry that happened to you." Words that sounded like empathy and understanding, forgiveness, even if no one would forget. Anne's books sold more than ever, which to some suggested Heavenly Creatures was the best thing to happen to her. I don't know about that, but I do know keeping secrets means a part of you stays closed off and neglected. And one outcome of Anne's forced revelation was she had to become more open, which meant her writing got better, more ambitious, more risky, with richer characters and bolder themes. It also gave her the courage to leave her safe haven in Scotland and pursue her lifelong dream of living in Los Angeles and working in Hollywood. She was prolific and successful until the very end. When she passed away this past year in 2023, her books had sold an estimated 26 million copies, and she'd won a coveted Edgar Award, kind of like the Oscars of crime fiction. As for Pauline Parker, reporters didn't search for Pauline as fervently as Juliet, but she was found in 1997. Pauline's real identity was, it turned out, a lot less scandalous. She had also left New Zealand under a new name and taught horseback riding to children with disabilities. She was strict Roman Catholic, lived essentially off the grid, no internet, no media. Her older sister Wendy was her de facto spokesperson. When Heavenly Creatures came out, Wendy was pleased with its accuracy, though it's unlikely Pauline ever saw it. What was compelling about Pauline was where she lived, in Scotland, 90 miles away from Anne Perry. But apparently the two didn't know about each other, and they never saw each other. When Anne was asked if she'd ever been tempted to reach out to Pauline, Anne said, no. Why would she? The toxic potency of that friendship dissipated years ago. In Heavenly Creatures, Pauline and Juliet's alternative fantasy life was called the Fourth World, a place where anything was possible. So as we bring this story to a close, I wanted to share my own Fourth World fantasy idea, a way for Peter Jackson and Fran Walsh to bring closure to what happened with Heavenly Creatures. It's a little meta, but I propose Peter and Fran revisit this story as a sequel. Only this movie is from Anne Perry's point of view. Their movie would start in July of 1994, when 55-year-old Anne answers the phone in Scotland and learns from her agent that her entire life is about to explode, thanks to a movie called Heavenly Creatures. Kate Winslet could come back to play Anne. Winslet's now 48 and close enough in age to pull it off. Even 40-something Melanie Lynskey can have a cameo. Peter and Fran would cast younger actors to play themselves, but it would be an interesting exercise for them to revisit Heavenly Creatures, now from the perspective of the real-life women whose lives were forever changed by their art. Now that would be a great movie. And a good bedtime story. Thanks for listening to Dead Sleep, True Crime for Bedtime. If you want to know more about Anne Perry, I strongly recommend reading The Search for Anne Perry, The Hidden Life of Best-Selling Crime Writer by Joanne Drayton, which I found on the Everend app. And check out Heavenly Creatures, which is hard to find. It's not streaming anywhere in the US, just DVD. But if you can track it down, it's worth seeing. I'll be back next week with an all-new True Crime for Bedtime story. Until then, thanks for listening, and nighty-night.